First thing I want to ask you is just a general thing. Music is such a human thing, isn't it? Why do you think that music makes us feel so good? What is it about music that makes us feel so good?
Whoa. I've got a slogan on my Instagram which says music really does make the world a better place. And it does. It enriches the world in some way. It takes you to a different place if you want it to. It can charge you up, get you dancing. It can enhance a reflective moment. So, in other words, I suppose it touches the heart and touches the soul. And it's an expression of creativity. I mean, there's so much you can say about in answer to that question, and I could probably talk for about another 10 minutes, other aspects of it, but it's just a very life enhancing experience.
And what do you think? I mean, obviously, what we're talking about at the moment is the Beatles.
Mm.
Um, we're now 55 plus years on from them starting their work, and yet they're as popular now as they ever were, and they're inspiring as many people
Mm.
as they ever were. And when you think about it, you got these lads from Liverpool, which wasn't the most kind of globally, almost sort of internationally kind of well read sort of city at the time. So how did these guys manage to kind of pick up on things that were going on well beyond their age, and well beyond their scope of being at that time?
Well, first of all, Liverpool's a hub. So I know people would sort of refer to it as a bit of a cliche that sailors and marine people brought records in from the States, but actually they did. You know, that's one of the ways that Liverpool connected to rock and roll. But specifically, the wellspring of what became the Beatles was Rock Island Line by Lonnie Donegan in 1955. It came out, but it was a hit in very early 56. And it inspired the skiffle generation. It was a very short-lived, you know, thing. Skiffle. It was very DIY. It was the punk music of its time, really. But it caught the imagination of John Lennon and some of his friends who put together this band called the Quarrymen and played skiffle. And it was Paul had heard about John, heard about his charisma, wanted to meet him, went to the church fete in summer 57, met up with John there, played 20 Flight Rock in the church hall before the band did their evening gig. And a couple of weeks later, John called him and they started playing. Paul's friend George joined the band, and the other guys from the Quarrymen then began to sort of fall away as it distilled into this core of those three, John, Paul, and George. So, you know, this was a process that took probably 3 years to evolve to the point where the Silver Beatles were going over to Hamburg and learning about life and learning about playing, learning about doing gigs, three or four of them in a day, night after night, you know. So it was a process. And I think then, I mean, how extraordinary is it that these two people met, John and Paul, and began to fire each other up to write these songs, which seemingly were just arriving from, midair. They weren't thinking about what they were writing particularly. It was just coming out of them. And I think that's one of the things with the Beatles that made all their records so accessible, was the fact that it was just two kids just writing. There was nothing getting in the way of the process of those lyrics going down onto the page or whatever it was, working songs that they wrote 182 songs in Paul's home alone in Fourth Lynn Road, they were writing everywhere. John was writing in the back of the van. It was just the prolificness was just absolutely mind blowing. So it was a an organic process, I think. And where you add the sort of worldly wisdom to it is you know, as we get well into the 60s and they go to America, they're meeting Bob Dylan, they're beginning to smoke dope, you know, the psychedelic thing begins to take over with Sergeant Pepper. And then they're expanding their mind experience in that way. And all of that then gets reflected in the lyrics. So it was a process. It was the real graph curve that just blows my mind is from Love Me Do in October 62 to Sergeant Pepper in the summer of 67. Well, and you think Sergeant Pepper was finished before then. So you've got 4 years from Love Me Do to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, or you know, A Day in the Life. That particularly last 18-month lead up to Sergeant Pepper, you know, it's astonishing how much musical landscape they've now discovered. It's, you know, it's just an amazing thing.
That's the thing, isn't it? People don't realise quite how condensed this incredible body of work was over. I mean, it's just a very short space of time in the psyche of life, you know.
Well, Love Me Do was very basic in its you know, it wasn't sophisticated as a recording. The harmonica on it was very much, I think, inspired by a record by Bruce Chanel called Hey Baby, which came out in 62, and the Beatles toured with Bruce Chanel. The harmonica player on the Bruce Chanel track is Delbert McClinton, who of course now is a very famous Nashville based, you know, worked with Bonnie Raitt. He's Grammy nominated, probably Grammy winning. But in those days, he was like 16 years old, played harmonica on Bruce Chanel's record. And that harmonica, if you listen to the harmonica on Hey Baby and then compare it with the harmonica on Love Me Do, the sound and everything, they're almost exactly the same.
Love Me Do.
Mm.
Was that the first time you heard them?
Yeah, it was.
And considering all the music that you have been exposed to over the years in your profession, what kind of impression did that make on you the first time you heard them?
Well, it grew. I mean, that was the thing actually about all those early Beatle records was the first time you heard them, you thought, yeah, this is okay. And then it was about the second or third or fourth hearing on the radio. You went, wow, this is such a great record. And, you know, Love Me Do, it got to number 17, which was probably about right, you know, at the time. So I quite like Love Me Do. Hearing it on the radio, the context at the time was a lot of the stuffing had been knocked out of rock and roll. You know, bearing in mind that up to this point we were taking our lead from America. Okay, so I mean, you know, in the mid-50s you got Elvis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry and the Everly Brothers and Buddy Holly, and I mean it was just so rich. But by the time we got into the early part of the 60s, Dick Clark had basically got hold of rock and roll and had bobbied it up. You know, that era of the bobbies. Bobby Vinton, Bobby Rydell, Bobby Darin, Bobby V, you know, and all of them were making pretty kind of limp-wristed records. I mean, Bobby Darin made a couple of, I still love Dream Lover actually, but you know, that Bobby V, Rubber Ball, and More Than I Can Say. And I think one of the few people that sort of managed to survive across and still making great records was Eddie Cochran. But outside of him and possibly Dion and Roy Orbison and some final sort of Everly Brothers hits, but American rock and roll was softening up horribly. And so the chart that Love Me Do went into had in it people like Eden Kane and Carl Denver, and you know, it wasn't the best moment for pop music, and we didn't yet know that Britain was going to take over the charts in the way that Britain did, again, we just had people like, well, Joe Brown had a picture of you, Billy Fury had a few hits, obviously Clear from the Shadows, but that UK takeover hadn't happened yet. So Love Me Do was just the first wave, as the next Please Please Me, From Me to You. They appeared on the London Palladium, to absolute crazy madness. And then came She Loves You, She Loves You. And She Loves You was up until that point, there had been a series of really massive records that had overridden everything else. The first one, I think, that I really remember was Jailhouse Rock, that went slamming into number one, and sort of created sales records as it went. I think the next one was It's Now or Never, then The Young Ones by Cliff Richard, and then the next really, really, really massive record was She Loves You by the Beatles. That it just sort of obliterated everything else. It was such a great record, particularly when you hearing it fresh, as I was doing. The new Beatle record is just coming out, and suddenly you hear it on the radio, and you just went, "Whoa!" And if that wasn't enough, then they followed that up with "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and those two, I think, represent the absolute sort of pinnacle of that first wave of crazy screaming madness. And these had been in the charts here before the Beatles broke through in America. The February 64, and the Ed Sullivan Show was the breakthrough in the States. So all of these records had been hits here first. And this is one of the reasons why the Beatles then filled the top five in the American charts. And at one point had 14 tracks in the top 100, because all of those hits and things they'd recorded so far hadn't really come out in the States yet. And so when they did, they all just burst into the charts together. So, yeah, again, it was like, Love Me Do came out in October 62. I think I Want to Hold Your Hand was December 63. So that just over 12 months in Britain was it was when it just sort of all Beatle hell let loose. It was just the most amazing thing.
I mean, it was totally unique, but I mean, they did hit in America at a particularly poignant time, didn't they, in America's history? I mean, having just lost JFK, Vietnam on the horizon, all these kind of things going on. America really needed a boost, didn't it?
Yeah. And the as we say, the music scene in America, I mean, that sort of limp-wristed thing lasted longer in the States. Here it was brushed away by, the Beatles and the Stones and the Hollies and the Searchers, and this fresh sound that just knocked everything else out of the charts at the time. Very few of the big American stars that were having hits through 62, let's say, was still in the charts in 64. The whole sort of British thing had knocked them out of the charts by then. But in America, that hadn't quite happened yet. So 63 was Jimmy Gilmer and the Fireballs and Daisy Paddle Picking and that sort of record. Really, So the Beatles appearing on Ed Sullivan in 64 it was a dam buster. It really was, because by then, once you get a few months on, then in the same way as the UK charts, the American charts are dominated by British records. So in fact, people even to this day, particularly working in country as I do, spending time in Nashville, there are a lot of musicians there whose dads, or even now coming towards their granddads, were watching the Ed Sullivan Show at that moment. The streets were empty in America. I mean, what was it? 86% of the available TV audience was actually watching that show that night. So it was actually life-changing for the Tom Pettys, let's say, of this world. And then you see over the next 2 or 3 years, obviously the Byrds, but and Bob Dylan, the Young Rascals, now American, and there was a sort of garage punk thing that happened in the mid 60s as well with the Seeds, and Yeah, and so the Beatles revitalized the charts on both sides of, of the Atlantic, but in America, literally changed people's lives. Yeah. Some of the feed lines into Beatle music at the time, they were massively influenced by the Everly Brothers, and they were massively influenced by Buddy Holly. And Buddy and the Everly Brothers came from country backgrounds. Buddy was Lubbock, Texas. Obviously, the Everly Brothers were Kentucky, and the mining communities of Kentucky, in particular, have always connected with roots, folk music, country. So, without even possibly kind of knowing it, if you know what I mean, it was a bit the same with me when I was buying those early records. I didn't think of Jerry Lee Lewis as being a country artist, but effectively, actually, he was. Where it became more overt with the Beatles as a sort of expression and a contact with the influences was Ringo covering Act Naturally, the Buck Owens song. And Buck Owens was outside of the radar for us in Britain, actually. So was Merle Haggard, and so some of those even outlaw country in the 70s with Willie and Waylon and people. It was slightly just outside our contact here in Britain, where our version of country and my version of country in the early 1970s, for example, was country rock. The Eagles and Poco, and you look at Blonde on Blonde as an album, 65, most of it recorded in Nashville. Bob Dylan's Nashville Skyline with Johnny Cash, 68, recorded in Nashville. Harvest by Neil Young, recorded in Nashville. So we were all, as it were, being influenced by country music without even completely knowing that that's what it was, that we were. I mean, obviously, Sweetheart of the Rodeo and Graham Parsons and Emmy, and that was my feed line in. And outside of Act Naturally, I suspect that was probably the Beatles' feed line in as well. But it wasn't just the Beatles in that respect, the Stones as well. Been really heavily influenced by country through the years. And even just recently, as we speak now, Mick Jagger's on the latest single by Brad Paisley, Drive of Shame. Yeah, so
it's a great track.
Great
track.
So the interlink over and across, and then if you go into other strands of country, particularly Southern rock, Greg Allman recently passed away, and the Allman Brothers were a massive wellspring of influence into what we now know as sort of Southern country, Georgia. So it all overlaps in that way, I think. But the Beatles were definitely, they had a country tinge about them without even knowing that that's what it was.
In terms of actually meeting somebody like Paul McCartney, how have you sort of? I think what fans would find interesting is what he's kind of like outside that megastar kind of element. How does he come across?
He's lovely. He comes across as just an ordinary bloke. Of course, he's not. He's Paul McCartney, but when you're in his company, it's just like talking to a mate. Seriously, it really is. I mean, Paul grew up in. When you go to Paul's house in Fourth Lynn Road, there's nothing particularly exceptional about it. In fact, it's funny because of the two, John always that album Working Class Hero. If you're imposing on the two of them, John and Paul, that class system that did sort of exist in the 50s, you would probably say that John was middle class because Mendelhoff Avenue is quite a leafy suburb of Liverpool, and Paul was more working class because Forthlin Road is, it's less grand than Mendip's completely. So they were slightly the other way around. Paul was from a slightly more working class family, and John was more middle class. But so I'm saying all that to illustrate the fact that Paul is kind of grounded in that way. He still remembers and loves the memories of growing up in Liverpool, having friends around him, start getting the band started. It's all still, and you talk to Paul about that meeting with John, at the church fete, him pedaling down on his bike to see John play, and he does get sort of animated, and it's still a fresh memory and moment for him in his mind. Although, you have to say he must have told the story over and over again, but he still brings enthusiasm to it. So it's 1972. I'm with my radio producer, Jeff Griffin. I suppose I've been doing the old grey whistle test now for about 3 or 4 months, something like that. And Jeff and I are getting out of my car outside Broadcasting House. And I'm just locking the car door. And I feel a tap on my shoulder, and I turn around, and this chap standing there in front of me going, just wanted to say, thumbs up like this, just wanted to say, love the show, great what you're doing, keep up the good work, And then this figure goes trotting off, jumps into a taxi, because I then noticed the taxi pulled up, the back door was open, so he'd obviously sort of jumped out and run over, and I watched the taxi go away, and this little face comes in the back window going, like this. It was so. Jeff and I look at each other and we go, he went, nah, it couldn't have been. So by the time we got into Egton House, we dismissed the possibility of this being Paul McCartney. Obviously, he must have been a bit of a lookalike or whatever, but it kind of, that couldn't have happened. Well, a few months later, Paul acquired the Buddy Holly song catalogue, and I went to Abbey Road to do an interview with him. And as we were setting up, I said, by the way, Jeff and I were outside Broadcasting House a couple of months ago, tap on the shoulder. I said, he said, of course it was me. So, how could it not? How could you not recognise Paul McCartney, But Linda took a particularly liking to me. I got on really well with Linda. So when they were doing Wings at the Speed of Sound, they asked me to go along to the MPL building, Soho Square, where Paul had got a studio in the basement, which was a complete recreation. The control room, he'd absolutely to measurement to the inch, he'd recreated the control room from Abbey Road and the desk on which they recorded Sergeant Pepper. Even to the point that I think Linda must have taken a photo of the studio through the window, and they'd blown this photograph up, and so that as you looked at that wall, it was as if you're looking into the studio. And even the detail, the clock on the studio wall, they got a tiny little clock. It actually worked, so, and there was a false door where you go out the door and then down the stairs to the studio. There was a false door, so you could open the door and there was one step before you came to the wall. So, it had been lovingly recreated, and I just thought I found that very endearing. I thought it was lovely. And I say, Linda and I just got on great. I really like Linda a lot. So while Linda was sort of around, she would be in touch with me quite regularly, and she'd invite me to go and see them play, or So and then the next time I spent any real time with Paul was at was it Nebworth that we were covering in '91? I was there with Radio 1, and we met up backstage and did an interview there. He was brilliant. And then it was when we did The Day John Met Paul. I interviewed him for that with Colin Hall from Mendips in Liverpool. And it was fantastic, actually, because I learned something that day that I didn't know before. And it was one of those penny dropping moments. You go, oh, wow. We were talking about John and Paul writing at Mendips and at Fourth Lynn Road. And when you go to Mendips, as you approach the house, there's a porch sort of thing. It's glass encased. Paul referred to it as the vestibule. So that when you're waiting for somebody to answer the door, you're not getting soaked. You're in this little glass enclosure. Paul said that they used to rehearse there, him and John, inside the glass enclosure because the sound was just so incredible. It was kind of a bit like singing in the shower or something. You know, you got this. It was so funny too because Paul was saying we could do it even though the space was really crammed because of course Paul played his guitar that way and John played his guitar, so they would stand shoulder to shoulder. It was so funny because Colin said, "Which way were you facing?" And Paul said, "No, that's getting a bit too Anaraki. Which way are you facing? Do you face the house or were you facing the garden? You know." But Paul said the sound in that room was incredible, and he you know, such a sort of live sound. And I said, "So was that the sound that John was always after? If you listen to Twist and Shout, or you listen to the vocal sound on the Rock and Roll album, you know, I thought that the sound that he was after was the sound that Gene Vincent got on Bebop because he'd always said that was one of his favorite records. And actually, if you listen to, yes, it was part of that, but the sound that he really had in his head that he wanted to recreate in the studio all those years later was the sound that he and Paul got when they rehearsed together in the vestibule at Mendiv's.
That's amazing, and that's a story that people just don't know.
Yeah. I
Really,
love that. I love that story. I loved it when Paul told me that because that was something I genuinely didn't know.
Their musicianship was, again, very unique. And I've spoken to a few people about Ringo's drumming,
Mm-hmm.
which I love. And I don't think the Beatles would have sounded like the Beatles had he not drummed the way he drummed.
No, they wouldn't.
And I also, but what I did want to ask you about was they all had a really quite different way of playing. And people, you know, people talk about the way that Paul plays. People have talked about the way that John plays. Not so many people talk about the way that George played, which is kind of interesting.
Mm.
That he was, because they all played. I mean, their synchronization and the way that they play was so beautiful. But what was it particularly, do you think, about their musicianship that stood out?
I think the fact that they were so oiled in, that they were a working group that just played and played and played and played through that time from 1960 to 65, probably you would say. God knows how many gigs they did together, particularly in Hamburg, you know, where you're playing 3 or 4 times a day. And that's all you're doing pretty much. You're playing, you're eating, sleeping, playing, eating, sleep, you know, it's that. And you just learn. You have a, you know, it's like it becomes a well-oiled machine. It's like the super football team that trains and trains and trains, and they go out onto the pitch and just express everything that's now become instinctive to them as a unit. And that was the Beatles. I think that was more than anything, in my opinion, what led them to sound the way they did. That they played and played and played and played and played and played together, and they just meshed. Yeah, I mean, I think more than anything, that's what it was. And then within that, then you got your own style. I mean, Ringo's drumming is so frill free, isn't it? He doesn't go in for big, you know. He's just driving the band. So Paul is a very underrated bass player. I think I mean, he's very, very good. And with George, I always think that George is sort of lacing his guitar through the songs. And of course, then, you know, the influences that he was taking on board, Ravi Shankar, the Indian sound that began to sort of seep into the Beatles music in 65. I mean, the first sort of hint at that, I guess, would be on Rubber Soul. You know, so they were open-minded, they were willing to be influenced, but more than anything else, I think it's that whole thing of just getting to know each other's playing so well and it becoming completely instinctive.
I think the other side of it, of course, for George Martin is as they progressed into being a studio band, you got to see these very intricate and very unusual orchestral elements to their music, which nobody had particularly done on that scale.
No, they hadn't. how do you legislate for all the things that fell into place to reach a point where the Beatles were able to express themselves in the way that they did, say, on Sgt. Pepper? It's quite incredible the way that it all fell into place. And George Martin's role in that cannot be overstated. And again, how is it that by chance they are working with a producer who'd had exactly the experience that was needed to express the ideas that they had in their heads? It's incredible, to the all the comedy stuff and the jazz stuff and that George had done before working with the Beatles. I mean, he was a house producer at Abbey Road, so sort of things that came through the door he would work on, and he'd learn how to sort of create a context for a comedy record and sound effects and stuff like that. So when it comes to I Am the Walrus and John wants a radio on the end of the track, George goes, I think, plugs up a transistor radio, gets it up on the fader, and there it is. This is what John, because I did that big interview with John in New York in '75, and I remember the way that John expressed it, because he said to me, I'd say to George, I want something that's going to go and and George would say, well, I think, John, I think I know the very thing that could, and off he'd go, and he'd sort of plug stuff up, and suddenly there would be that sound. And he was a brilliant, George was an absolutely brilliant arranger and superb musician himself. He was undercredited for the work that he did on Beatle albums. And even in my life, the harpsichord, that's George Martin. So his role in the expression of the Beatles music cannot be overstated. He was so important to them.
I mean, it's interesting watching, albeit it was bootlegs doing Sgt. Pepper's, the Sgt. Pepper album, Royal Albert Hall. But you look across at this entire Liverpool Royal Philharmonic, and all of these areas where you see the string instruments, the wind instruments, percussion, and all of these things coming together, and you just think it's extraordinary to think that these four lads plus their producer managed to create this enormous sound at the time, which was like filling somewhere like the Royal Albert Hall with an orchestra, but actually having to do it with not a lot of people. I mean, they didn't have that orchestra, did they?
Well, by then, of course, the time Sgt. Pepper, they're not touring anymore. So the issues of reproducing Sgt. Pepper on stage don't come into play, because they don't try and recreate it on stage. So they can therefore do whatever the hell they like in the studio, and just to have it as that's what it is. It's a studio record. And actually, funnily enough, you talk to Ringo about the recording of Sgt. Pepper, and he hated it. He was so bored because he didn't have anything to. Once he put the tracks down, that was kind of it. And then the rest of it was layering and building and layering, and then finding ways of matching two tape machines with the tape going between the two, and time-consuming stuff that was driving some of people mad with boredom, as it took so long to actually. It was a major. The technology in those days wasn't kind to what you were trying to do with it, and so just that in itself, there were so many challenges in terms of creating some of the effects and everything they wanted to use on Sgt. Pepper. So that's very time consuming. So, you get a different take. Sgt. Pepper was really, I think the whole kind of, the engine of it was Paul, definitely. Going over to LA and seeing Brian working on Pet Sounds, Brian Wilson, for the Beach Boys. And Pet Sounds setting a new bar. There's no doubt about that. And Paul wanting to emulate that. It set a challenge for the Beatles to live up to Pet Sounds, and Paul was determined to do it. They have now come off the road. There's hardly any point in them playing live anymore, because the equipment available to them, the power of the speakers was totally overwhelmed by the noise of the crowds. So if you can't hear a note you're playing, what what's the point? And that's where they'd reached. So okay, let's be Phil Spector. Let's be Brian Wilson. Let's go into the studio and let's create this amazing wall of sound. And so that's what they did. And I say, it wasn't the easiest thing for the people not directly involved in that production situation at that particular moment to not, what do? Go up to the canteen and go off for a drive, and then come back and they're still working on this little, I've done that in the studio as a producer, this little millimeter of tape, a delayed echo or something, that with the equipment in those days took ages and ages to set up just to create 2 seconds. I think that was a lot of it at the time. Ringo was bored stiff through Sergeant Pepper. Yeah.
But I think also from the point of view of it was a big risk for the fans, wasn't it? I mean, we were talking earlier on about how condensed this whole career was really in time, and how much they progressed and how many different things they did, their look, the way they produced music. But Sergeant Pepper and that whole and the lead up to that through that studio period, that was a huge risk for them with their fan base, wasn't it?
Yeah, I suppose so. I think, well, you make that comparison with the Beach Boys, and Pet Sounds commercially was a disaster in America. The record company just didn't get it. They didn't put a lot of weight behind it. People were very, had a very narrow mindset as to what the Beach Boys were. They were this harmony group, surfing brothers. That was it. So the idea that the Beach Boys were going to start pushing out the creative boundaries a little bit, America just didn't really get it. It was a bit like I Can Tina Turner, River Deep, Mountain High. They just didn't get it. So, but even to this day, when American touring musicians come over to the UK, they instantly recognize that we have a very open mind in this country, in terms of allowing people space to experiment a little bit and come up with things that are unexpected. So I think with the Beatles here, there was, and anyway, the time, the Summer of Love, that it was a time of open-minded optimism, which the Beatles just captured. All You Need Is Love was that summer as well. And the Beatles just absolutely hit that nail, just bang, straight on the head. And the look of Sergeant Pepper, the imagination of the cover, the gatefold, the inserts, everything about it was challenging, different, interesting. I think interesting is one of the most important words. It was just so different, but we had the mindset to accept that. I suspect. I mean, I know that in America initially there were reservations there about Sergeant Pepper. Oh my God, what are the Beatles? What the hell are they doing? Good morning, chickens, and. So, but we've got a very broad-minded attitude towards things in this country by comparison, I think. So that helped them enormously for Sergeant Pepper to establish that way.
Good Morning, of course, had that sort of brilliant outro,
Yeah.
which is comic in many ways because it's one animal that can hunt the next one down.
Yes. Yes.
At the end, and
Yeah.
that's a really, and that's sort of again that kind of almost like Spike Milligan-esque
Yeah.
surreal humour.
Yeah. It really
cropped
is.
up in a lot of their work.
Yes. Well, of course, the Beatles. Well, John was a big Goons / Spike Milligan fan. I mean, even some of the phraseology he used. I remember again when he and I were talking, he was talking about the rock and roll album, the producer Phil Spector, and he used the phrase, Phil Spector worked in strange ways his woodwork to perform. And that's right out of Milligan, isn't it? That's a Goons
Totally.
script line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see through the generations in different genres that music being reproduced or reimagined.
Mm.
And obviously you have people that are almost verbatim and do it brilliantly, can actually get up on stage and almost reproduce that sound note for note.
Mm.
But there are other people that are kind of taking their own spin on it. There's two views, aren't there? There's a purist view, which is, what the hell are they doing?
Mm.
And there's another view, which is, great, this music is so brilliant that it's surviving the decades and centuries probably beyond us now. Um, do you enjoy seeing different interpretations of their music through different bands and different genres now? So country, rock, people just taking it on in different ways and enjoying it that way.
Well, I think that the key thing about Sergeant Pepper was how liberating it was. I mean, that's in addition to the brilliance of it as a record, but the cause and effect. The effect of Sergeant Pepper was very liberalizing, and there are other bands coming along that were stretching the boundaries as well. Jimi Hendrix had just arrived, Pink Floyd were just getting going. So it was part of a wheel that had already started to turn, but more than any other record, because the Beatles were so influential, that it basically said to musicians that followed that record, anything is possible. So then we did that. You can literally draw a line there, that everything changed, because within 12 months, albums had overtaken singles as the most potent sales force. Bands had started expanding into double albums, triple albums. I'm not saying that this was all a good thing, because some of it did get very self-indulgent. But basically what the Beatles said to arriving musicians or existing musicians was, you don't have to conform to 3-minute singles. You can expand into whatever you feel is the best setting to express what it is you want to say. And that is something that still echoes today, because within sort of pop music, rock music, country in particular is very, very good at absorbing influences going on around it that don't threaten the integrity of the music itself. Country's always done this brilliantly. That's why it's so long lasting, I think. Country music, it's one of the most resilient of musical genres, probably the most when you think about it, because even jazz and blues are a less effective force these days than they used to be, but country continues to be the biggest genre in America. Prior to Sergeant Pepper, obviously, Revolver, Rubber Soul, but were getting more complicated. But initially, the expression of the Beatles' music was fabulously simple. The lyrics just connected with people. Well, that's another big thing about country, of course, that the lyrics connect with the fans who love the music. And it was so much the same way with the Beatles. And She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, they were just such simple expressions that as a 17-year-old myself, just starting to go out with girls and stuff like that, it was sort of, they were writing my life. So there was a simplicity about their music. There was a simplicity of melody, of lyrical expression. John and Paul just writing without second guessing it. It was just coming out of them in that amazing way. So I think it was cutting through, just hitting you. There was nothing getting in the way of you just enjoying these records for 2.5 minutes of just sheer brilliant excitement. I still can remember the feeling I felt when I heard I Want to Hold Your Hand. I thought She Loves You was the pinnacle of pop excitement. And then they came up with I Want to Hold Your Hand. I just thought, wow, it's sensationally good. Yeah, so that's it. There's a simplicity and just a joy about their music that just lifts your heart. Yeah.
Will there still, in your view, be a family of Beatles fans in 50 years' time, 100 years' time?
Yeah, without doubt. Yeah, in the same way that you know, with the names Brahms or Tchaikovsky or are important, or Robert Johnson and Charlie Patton, or Chuck Berry and Elvis. You know, the Beatles. We still know all those names years and years after. That it'll be the same with the Beatles. You could, you have these absolute giants of music whose names sustain, and that'll happen to the Beatles definitely. Yeah. I mean, just imagine the 100-year anniversary of the release of Sergeant Pepper. It's going to happen.
Well, we better cryogenically immerse ourselves for that occasion. I'm going to get into the cold box right now.
Yeah.
And wait for that. Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I
love talking the Beatles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Good one, Simon.
Good, thank you.